everybody, Dr. Sajewicz here again, and I wanted to go over a particular case with you highlighting how an awesome technologist can make your life and the life of your patients just fantastic. Okay, so here's the deal. I don't know sometimes what's going on in the ER. It's just like so busy and so crazy that I think the ER for docs get really swamped, and I don't know if they're at their wits' end or they're seeing a lot of the same complaints in one night. But anyway, it seemed like this one night on call, I was working with a technologist, and then there was a fire sale going on of GI bleed studies. So a GI bleed CT, I don't know how you guys do it, but how we do it at our institution, we do a 3-phase exam. What the hell does that mean? Well, so we do a non-contrast exam of the abdomen and pelvis, followed by an arterial exam. Okay, so you're injecting contrast, and then you're kind of timing the contrast bolus to see the contrast in the arteries, and then you're doing a delayed phase. So you're scanning the patient 3 times through the abdomen and pelvis, and you're looking for a bleed. Okay, now there's reasons why you do 3-phase. I've seen some places that, I think I've read articles too, that some places do 4 phases, but we don't do that. So we do a 3-phase. This is for a real GI bleed case. This isn't just for, someone who tests positive or something for GI bleeding. This is where the patient comes in and, they state that they've been bleeding or hemorrhaging from, the rectum or from the anus, that kind of thing, and then the ER doc confirms it. So this particular night, this was the 3rd GI bleed rule out in a row, and the history didn't seem to make sense. Now, this didn't even come to my attention until the tech brought it up. So this is one of my senior techs. Actually, this is the lead CT tech that I have at my institution, and she is like freaking fantastic. She's awesome. And she noticed that the history didn't make sense, okay? History said vaginal bleeding, but the ER doc ordered a GI bleed CT scan, which, obviously uses 3 phases. For something like vaginal bleeding, we would potentially do an ultrasound or just do a single phase CT to kind of look for like a mass or something in the uterus, that kind of thing, some kind of abnormality in the pelvis. But so it didn't make sense to her. So she called me and we discussed it. And before I really had anything to say to her, she's like, well, I looked in the chart and there's no mention of anything about a GI bleed, and it says in the ER doc, physician's note that there's a concern for vaginal bleeding. So I didn't even have to ask her if she looked in the chart. She already did that ahead of time. And she's investigating all of this on her own without even talking to me first. And then before I asked my next question, which I always ask, is like, are there any prior studies? Well, what did she do? Yeah, she already looked. She's like, no, there are no prior exams. And she told me that. So already I know she did her homework. And she checked the chart. She looked at the doc's note. She noted that there was no concern for a GI bleed. There was no prior exams to compare with. And now she's at a loss. So at this point, it's out of her hands. She doesn't know what to do, right? So she calls me, which is great. This is what you're supposed to do. Okay, the only other thing, that she could have done was call the ER doc, but, that's uncomfortable for techs at times because, they're busy and they're ordering stuff. And it's much easier to have a doctor-to-doctor conversation to really figure out what the right test is rather than have the tech do it, who sometimes might feel uncomfortable. I mean, sometimes the tech knows. Sometimes the tech knows when the wrong order is put in. Like say ER orders a regular chest with contrast and it's a rule out pulmonary embolism. Well, they obviously know at that point to change it to a CT pulmonary angiogram. Okay, I mean, that's how it works at our institution. You have to have the right order in place to do the right study. Yeah, so they know those sort of things. But something like this is a perfect opportunity for a doctor-to-doctor conversation to figure out, hey, what's really going on with the patient? What do we have to do? So, yeah, next step, I called the ER doc, and he was like, yeah, I really don't think there's a GI bleed. There's probably some sort of bleeding from the vagina, but we're not really sure. And so, you know what? I spoke with the doc, and we decided to err on the side of less radiation, less contrast, and just do a simple routine abdomen pelvis CT with contrast. And if we saw anything weird, then we can go back and do a rule out GI bleed study or something if we really needed to. Okay, so yeah, we answered the question. The patient had some sort of mass in the uterus, which you can't really see that well on CT anyway, so the patient probably should have got an ultrasound to begin with, but the ER doc seemed kind of set on doing a CT, so that's what we did. But yeah, the tech did everything perfectly, and this is what I guess myself and a radiologist in general kind of expect from our senior techs, from the techs that are really well trained and know what to do and have lots of experience. And why is this important? Well, this is important if you want to be a really good tech at your institution, okay? And some of the training I want to set up down the road is for technologists who want to be that guru tech at their hospital or at their institution. They want to be the go-to person that can answer all the tough questions, that does all the right things, that everybody turns to when there's a problem, okay? So yeah, this tech knew exactly what to do. She did everything right. She called me when it was out of her purview, and she facilitated a doctor-to-doctor conversation about the right exam. Okay, so let me just follow this up with what a GI bleed study looks like, because it's kind of fun, and why we do 3 phases. Okay, so why we do 3 phases at my hospital. So as you can see here, I'm scrolling through the non-contrast phase. Okay, so if this is the non-contrast phase, what the hell is all this bright stuff in the stomach? Well, this is something the patient ate. Either a medication, I mean, it's almost always a medication, probably like bicarb. So the patient has like some sort of abdominal pain, and they take like, sodium bicarb, and it just looks dense. Or, they take, Pepto-Bismol, right? They drink a whole bunch of that, and it sits in the stomach or goes into the bowel, and you get some of this bright stuff sitting in the stomach. Well, if we didn't do the non-contrast phase, and we see that somewhere out in other parts of the bowel, how the hell am I going to know if that's contrast, or that's contrast from the study, or if that's like Pepto-Bismol, right? If it's contrast from the study and it's intraluminal, well, this patient has a GI bleed. So that's why you do the non-contrast portion first. You want to compare ahead of time the non-contrast stuff with the contrast phases to see what's going on. Let's say I'm going to bring in the arterial phase. Okay, so here, arterial phase. Why do we know this is the arterial phase? Well, look at the aorta. The aorta is really bright. Okay, the mesenteric vessels are really bright. Okay, so you have the left renal vein, the left renal artery, right renal artery. You have a celiac artery here and a superior mesenteric artery, all very bright with contrast. You can see a nice enhancement in the wall of the stomach. The bright stuff that was there before in the stomach is there now again, because that's something the patient drank or ate, and that's sitting there. But what we do see on this study is the little tiny arteries leading up to some small bowel here in the left abdomen. And then what is this? You see that there, that little blush of contrast? Well, that's something we would call an angioectasia. And what's an angioectasia? Well, you can get these tangle of vessels to end up in the wall of the intestines, and sometimes they can bleed. Now, is this bleeding in this patient? I mean, all I see is these little blushes of contrast in the wall of the intestine. To make sure if it's bleeding or not, well, if you don't see active contrast or contrast sitting kind of in the lumen of the bowel on the arterial phase, well, then you go to the venous phase. So this is a delayed phase, somewhere around 90 seconds after the contrast is given, or 100 seconds. I mean, each institution does theirs differently. And where those angioectasias were before, I mean, I could still see one enhancing here, but I don't see any pooling of contrast in the bowel. So there's no active bleeding here from these angioectasias. And that was important, because if I call active bleeding, then the next step is for the ER to call, like, probably a GI surgeon or interventional radiology to do some sort of embolization of the bowel. And there are all sorts of complications that can occur when you get a bowel surgery or you get an embolization done. So that's quite important to do the study this way in order to, prevent bad things from happening, right? Somebody bleeding and not discovering it, or send the patient to the right next steps, right, in their care. Anyway, I wanted to. This little video was to mainly highlight how a really good CT tech can make a huge difference in your life as a radiologist and in the patient's life. Okay, and part of some of the training I am working on going forward is, how do you get techs that are new, right? Maybe they just came over from X-ray and they're just trying out CT. They learned on the job, but they don't feel comfortable with what they're doing. How do you get techs that are new into CT and make them feel comfortable that they know what they're doing and they really like their job and they don't go home nervous and stressed every night that they do the right thing? I mean, you want to have techs that are kind of confident and know what to say to the ER docs. They know how to work with the radiologists. It takes a lot of years to do that, okay? I want to fast forward that sort of training. I want to make it easy for the new techs to feel comfortable at their job and be good at their job. Okay, so that's all I have for you guys on this video, and we'll see you next time.